This week on C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast, Stephen Witt talks with Business Insider reporter Emma Cosgrove about his new book, The Thinking Machine, Jensen Huang, Nvidia, and the world's most coveted microchip. The book offers a behind-the-scenes look at the rise of Nvidia, a company that began at a Denny's restaurant 31 years ago, and is now leading the charge into the future of artificial intelligence.
Hi, Stephen. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I want to start at the beginning of the story if we can. It's generally the best thing to do. And ask you how long you've been familiar with Nvidia. I think it's longer than most of us.
Yeah, I started with Nvidia actually way back in the early 2000s when I used to work in the financial industry. And we would sort of trade their stock. We actually made fun of their stock because it didn't go anywhere for a very long time. At the time, they made they only made these kind of video game controllers, these 3D renderers for hardware. And the CEO, Jensen Huang, was seen as a somewhat unusual, maybe even kind of erratic figure. And he would make these grand pronouncements about things that were going to happen. And then those things didn't really happen. And for 10 years, his stock price went nowhere. So I had followed them in this way for a long time, and then I kind of just stopped paying attention. I came back in 2022 when the launch of like ChatGPT and all these similar systems, all these AI systems. And as I started researching that stuff, I learned to my amazement that Jensen had built this entire platform that made it work. All of this AI technology, it was all running on his repurposed video game hardware. So that was a fascinating story, and Jensen's a fascinating individual, and that kind of was what created this book.
I wonder if you can erase the last 3-4 years in your mind and tell us what Jensen was like in the days before ChatGPT, because we will never, in my mind, he will never not be wearing that leather jacket. He will never not be standing on the stage. Could you tell us what his sort of character, what his mannerisms, what was he like before ChatGPT?
Yeah, sure. Sure. The leather jacket, the look is only about 10 years old, and Nvidia is 30 years old. If you go back and watch old videos of him, he's quite young. Nvidia entered the S&P 500 when Jensen was just 38 years old, and he was the CEO. So he was one of the youngest CEOs in kind of the entire American stock index. But he didn't dress very cool. You know, he wore like an oversized suit. He didn't look that good. He kind of looked like he bought most of his wardrobe at like Kohl's or somewhere. But his force of personality was still there. Jensen is extremely intense, and this has never changed. One of his executives compared him to kind of interacting with him to sticking your finger in the light socket. And that is what it's like when you're around Jensen. It's just like he's wound as tight as a spring. And he's so intense, he's so intelligent, and he's so efficient, there's not any wasted moment in what he says or thinks. The leather came along when AI came along. For years before that, he'd sort of been experimenting with different wardrobe options. I think his wife pushed him to kind of like do an upgrade to what he wore. His daughter also was working at LVMH, Louis Vuitton, and I think she influenced him as well. So he experimented with a bunch of wardrobe options. It wasn't quite like Steve Jobs. It was more like an engineer. You know, Jensen's an engineer. He's going to A/B test his wardrobe. He's going to swap in and out different pieces until he feels that he's kind of perfecting what the correct look is. Sometime around 2014, just as Nvidia was pivoting completely to AI, Jensen walked onto stage at his GTC technology conference wearing what we think of as the kind of signature Jensen outfit. And so that's kind of when he finally made the kind of final decision that I'm going to wear this leather jacket all the time. Before that, you know, he was a young guy, he was a hungry guy, but he worked in the video game industry.
I was going to make that Steve Jobs parable, and it sounds like when you see someone wearing a uniform in the business world, it's often because sort of the Barack Obama theory of not making decisions that you don't need to make. Is that what you read from Jensen, or has he optimized his wardrobe and this is it? We'll get off of jackets in a minute.
Somewhat. Yeah, somewhat. He when I interviewed him at Caltech, he was wearing a Thomas Burberry black T-shirt, and I noticed that he had worn that in 3 other interviews that I talked to him in. And I was like, "What's up with the T-shirt?" And he's like, "Oh yeah, I just bought 24 of these T-shirts in 2020, and I've just been wearing them every day ever since." Every minute of Jensen's time is very valuable. The investment decisions he makes over the course of the year, he directs hundreds of billions of dollars in capital. So like 1 minute of his time is worth $1 million. So normal things that people would think of as kind of just like a normal part of the day, like getting dressed or picking out what to wear, he almost can't afford to do that.
1 minute for 1 million. Is that a calculation you've done or is that a guess?
Jensen calls this CEO math. So it's not correct. I didn't do the math, but roughly it's right.
Gotcha. Okay. A couple times during this conversation, we're going to have a quick vocab check because I feel like some terms are going to come up that aren't necessarily in everyone's lexicon.
Sure.
So I'm wondering if in layman's terms, you could just break down what is a GPU, a graphics processing unit?
Yeah, GPU is just a kind of microchip that works differently than your Intel CPU or central processing unit. So the CPU is the microchip in the center of your computer that runs everything. It does all the math, all the kind of like main math that your computer needs to do. The GPU started out as an additional microchip, kind of an add-on. So if you were doing intense graphics processing for like video games, it wouldn't go to Intel's microchip. It would instead be rerouted to Nvidia's microchip because it was customized to do that faster, the graphics processing unit. As it turned out, the circuitry in the graphic processing unit could do all sorts of other complex calculations in scientific computing, in what they call high performance computing, basically supercomputing. So when you chained a bunch of these GPUs together, it acted like a cheap, efficient, and extremely powerful supercomputer.
The semiconductor industry that you've just helped us understand is notoriously secretive due to competitive sensitivity. Yes. and the power behind everything you just described. So I'm wondering if you could tell us, how did you get as much access as you did to write this book?
I'm not totally sure, but I think one thing that helped was before the first time I interviewed Jensen, I like to do a lot of research before I interview somebody. But in Jensen's case, I actually did 4 or 5 times as much research as I normally do. I actually went back to the New York Times archives and read every single article, every single time Nvidia had ever appeared in the New York Times, going back to the 90s. And then I went on YouTube and I watched every interview I could find with Jensen. And I built like a big biography of him. This is before I met him. A dossier, actually, of not only where he'd worked and where he went to school, but also how tall I thought he was, the year he was born, where he lived, where he met his wife, if he had any religious beliefs, if he had any political beliefs. And so I then, from this biography, determined that I would only ask questions that no journalist, I was pretty sure, had ever asked Jensen before. So in my first interview, I sat down with him and I had noticed on an old program from 2009 that Jensen had mentioned he almost died once in a car accident. But the interviewer didn't follow up and Jensen had never really mentioned it again in any interview. So one of my first questions to Jensen was, tell me about the time you almost died in a car accident. And he kind of went like this. He said, oh, you heard about that, huh? And so I think it turned out this was exactly the right approach for Jensen. Whenever any of his executives talk to him, they have to be extremely well prepared because, as I mentioned, his time is so valuable. So for a full hour, I just asked Jensen questions that I was pretty sure no journalist had ever asked before. At times this made him a little uncomfortable, I think, because some of the questions were a little probing. But it was enough, I think, to convince them that I really cared about the company, that I was passionate about what Nvidia was doing, and I really wanted to explain it to readers. This wasn't just an assignment. I think what Nvidia has accomplished with its circuitry, with its microchip, will go down in history as the equivalent to maybe the Wright brothers airplane or some of Thomas Edison's inventions. It's that important. It's that interesting. And I think they sense my passion for that.
Yeah, you also, through those questions, got sort of deeper into Jensen's personality and sort of psychology than I think than anyone else has. And one of the things you note, and I hear from folks who work at Nvidia all the time, is that he has this remarkable memory, which I would imagine came in handy when you were asking about events that happened decades ago. How did you experience that?
He's got a great he's got a great memory. Jensen's also a great storyteller. Jensen's very charismatic. He loves to entertain, and he loves a good soundbite. So you have to be a little careful with Jensen sometimes because he will say things that are not strictly true just to amuse himself, and I think to amuse you. He does have a great memory, though. He's got an incredibly sharp mind. His intellect is just firing all the time. And he's so much of a visionary that at times it can even be kind of difficult to understand what he's talking about or what he means. He'll say things that often seem a little crazy. And I think this is actually something he's engineered himself to do. He can't be conventional in his industry. If he's conventional when it comes to designing microchips, everyone else will just copy what he's doing. He has to do things that look a little crazy, so crazy in fact that his competitors won't follow where he's going. This is where the whole GPU supercomputing effort came from. For 10 years, Nvidia lost money doing this. It was not an obvious play. And none of his, Intel, AMD, none of them really followed suit. It was just Nvidia doing this. So then, when GPU connected with AI, they were sort of alone. They were alone to enjoy the profits from it because they were so far away from what their competitors were doing. This is Jensen's business logic. He calls it the $0 billion market. He's always looking for small or even non-existent markets where he can build a product that functionally just has almost no customers at all and then grow an entire market sector around it. That's what Jensen did with AI hardware. There was no AI hardware segment. That was not a thing that existed 15 years ago. Jensen invented it.
The persona you just described in the present day sounds like a genius, but in the past, when AI isn't on the radar yet, it sounds like a madman or a crackpot. Is that what you thought in your days when you were in finance?
I don't know if I thought of him as a madman. I think the question was, is Jensen just kind of like squandering shareholders' money on this bizarre science project? CEOs will often pursue kind of unusual strategies, and this creates questions from investors. The platform I'm talking about, the supercomputing platform, it's called CUDA. It started in 2003. That's when they started developing it in secret. It officially launched in 2006. And in 2013, it did not have a lot of customers. So it was a 10-year investment in this, and it just wasn't paying off. And investors could tell. I mean, Nvidia's stock price was in the toilet. Nvidia was added to the S&P 500 in late 2001. It replaced Enron, actually. And from the day it's added, every American shareholder, everyone's retirement account, at least some of their money is put in Nvidia stock. And for basically 13 or 14 years, it did nothing. It just kind of went like this. It looked like a heart attack, the EKG of someone having a heart attack. It was just erratic and bouncing around like crazy. And it wasn't really until the supercomputing platform somewhat unexpectedly connected with AI research that the company really took off. So did they get lucky? I don't think they got lucky, though. Because Jensen had always said, look, if I build this thing, if I build this supercomputing platform, someday there's going to be some kind of scientific user who's going to come and gravitate to this thing and unlock some fantastic new kind of like functionality that we never thought of before. They didn't know it was going to be AI. In fact, they had no AI people on staff at Nvidia. But they did think something like this would happen. And so I think Jensen deserves some credit for that. His vision was very far ahead, much further ahead than sort of the investor's vision, to be honest. He saw things that his investors could not. And this was challenging for Jensen for a time. I mean, there was even an activist investor who got involved with Nvidia stock for a while, asking pointed questions of the CEO and sending kind of like, I wouldn't say menacing, but a letter to the board with certain overtones questioning Jensen's investment decisions. So, Jensen was a very controversial figure for a long time. And remember, Jensen was not young when Nvidia found AI. I mean, he was over 50 years old, and he had been in the CEO's chair for 20 years. So this was a long time in the making. Building Nvidia in this way was a long time.
I'm going to ask you about that moment in a second, but you did mention CUDA, which is another one of my vocabulary words I was hoping we could define for the audience. So what is CUDA?
CUDA stands for Compute Unified Domain Architecture, which doesn't clear things up at all. But basically what CUDA is it's a switch. If you imagine your graphics controller in your video game, or your video game hardware in your computer, you flick this switch, you turn the GPU over, and it becomes a supercomputer. So CUDA is the software platform that opens up these circuits to supercomputing. It transforms the video game hardware into supercomputing hardware. That's what it does. That's kind of its core function. Actually, before CUDA existed, some of the scientists were so interested in NVIDIA's hardware that they had kind of jerry-rigged something like CUDA. They built kind of like a program called Brook, which actually hacked the shading and the triangles in the graphics controller to do important scientific calculations. When Jensen saw that, he said, these guys who are like kind of hacking my hardware, I'm not going to get upset. I'm actually going to hire them. I'm going to bring them into my team and take these hackers and have them build this platform for real with the official NVIDIA endorsement. He was very interested in the fact that like people doing medical imaging or weather forecasting were already, even before he'd shown up, taking these video game cards and kind of daisy chaining them in big stacks to do low budget supercomputing. And he saw this as a use that he wanted to enable. In fact, he lost money to do this, but he had a lot of confidence that something would be unlocked. He went to Taiwan at one point, I think in the late 2000s, and he visited with a professor of physics. And this guy was doing a simulation of kind of the early formation of matter, of material, immediately after the Big Bang, in the first few seconds after the Big Bang. And this simulation required an enormous amount of computational power. And time on a supercomputer is very expensive, and this guy couldn't afford it. He couldn't get access. So instead, he built a homebrew supercomputer by jerry-rigging a bunch of NVIDIA video game cards together. A bunch of NVIDIA video game cards together in a closet in his office. And it was so hot that he needed to get oscillating desk fans to blow on the cards so they wouldn't overheat. So Jensen saw this, and the guy said to Jensen, you've made my life's work possible. You've made it possible for me to do my life's work with this CUDA platform, with this low-budget supercomputing platform. And this gave Jensen confidence that he was doing the right thing. Even when investors said, what are you doing? This doesn't make sense. Scientists were telling him, this platform is important. It's unlocking functionality that I've never had before. And Jensen, that's what mattered to him, what the scientists were telling him.
Yeah, it's always fascinating to see how the AI moment is bringing together academia and industry when they're often quite separate. And Brook is a great example. I wonder if you could speak about the relationship between NVIDIA and sort of cutting edge researchers across fields up until today. I mean, now AI is an area of research, but that's a relatively new phenomenon. There are so many industries that relied on supercomputers for decades.
Yeah, Jensen and NVIDIA basically is a giant R&D laboratory. I mean, they have no manufacturing facilities. That's all outsourced. It's basically just a big computing R&D lab. And for this reason, they bring a lot of talent in from academia. They have very close ties to academia, Stanford in particular. In fact, in 2009, Jensen hired away the chairman of the computer science department at Stanford to come work for NVIDIA. And this was really one of his key hires. The guy's name is Bill Dolly. And Bill is he's kind of like Indiana Jones. He's like an adventure seeker. He survived a plane crash once. When I talked to him, he just sailed across the Caribbean. He goes like downhill ski racing. And when he's not doing all that stuff, he designs like world-class computer hardware, okay? But Dolly was the chairman of the computer science department, and he was thinking of leaving for industry. And Dolly, he's the chair of Stanford. He can go anywhere. He can go to Google. He can go to Intel. He can go to any firm. But in 2009, Jensen convinced him to come to NVIDIA. This is before AI. Now, at this time, NVIDIA was struggling to get $10 billion in market capitalization. Their stock price was absolutely in the toilet. And they were actually the laughing stock, at least among investors, of the semiconductor industry. But I talked to Dolly and I said, why did you go to NVIDIA specifically? And he said, Jensen is just a world-class computer scientist. Jensen's a leader. And he's going to lead people towards a frontier of computing that even most people, even their investors, can't imagine. And he said, there was a huge risk in me going, but there was a bigger risk in not being there. There was a bigger risk in not being on the front lines of the most important computing technology in the world. And this is where Jensen constantly positions himself. A lot of people have asked me, why is it so hard to compete against Nvidia? Well, it's actually not how they design the circuits. You can kind of pry open the lid on a microchip and inspect it with a metallurgical microscope, and you can see everything that it's doing, right? There's no trade secret there. You can just look directly at it, and if you're familiar with the technology, you can kind of create a map of it and clone it. Where the competitive advantage comes from is from the software. And in particular, it comes from what are called the software development kits. And what these are the tools that scientists use. So Jensen, he organizes these conferences. He's constantly talking to world-class computer scientists in weather forecasting, in kind of robotics, and of course, in AI. And he's saying, what can I do? What can Nvidia do to turbocharge your workflow? What would you do if I could make everything you do go 1,000 times faster? And then he will go back to his software teams and build these kits that actually do this, right? These software development kits that turbocharge the workflow of the most important scientific researchers in the world. And Jensen will lose money to do this, at least initially.
C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast.
He will lose tons of money to do this, just to be there. In fact, CUDA's first application cost, it was for a pair of breast cancer imaging researchers, tomography. Essentially what they were doing was trying to create better 3D scans of like a mammogram. And they spent something like, Nvidia spent something like $10 million building these guys a better mammogram machine, building these guys better mammogram imaging processing. And then they had 2 customers at the end of that. They spent $10 million to develop software for 2 guys. But for Jensen, this was great because he was on the frontier and no one else is there. And I think that's very important to understand when we talk about NVIDIA.
I love hearing you talk about Jensen's leadership, and I want to get into sort of how he creates this environment of constantly being at the edge. There's a quote that I've written down 1,000,000 times from your book that I'll carry with me through my reporting on NVIDIA, which is Huang's combination of love, fear, and guilt was a seductive and powerful motivator. So you spoke to over 100 people who have or currently work at NVIDIA. They all had a tender story about Jensen, and they all had a story that led you to call him carnivorous. I wonder if you could speak to those two dynamics.
Sure. I think Jensen at his core is actually just the world's nicest guy. He's a great family man. He's really dedicated to his wife. His friends are like, oh, he's just this mischievous, fun-loving, wonderful guy. He's full of energy. He's full of life. He's so intelligent. And then you talk to his employees and they don't describe him in these terms. They love him, but they're also a little afraid of him because Jensen has a tendency to kind of fly off the handle and to start screaming at people. And so if you drop the ball in NVIDIA, Jensen's going to make you stand up in front of everyone at the company. Could be 100, 200 people. And then he will just tear you apart. I mean, he will scream at you. He will yell at you. He will question your dedication. He will question your professionalism. He will question your skill. He will question your capabilities in the role that you are in and whether maybe you wouldn't be better in some other role. So it's very humiliating to go through this process. And I think almost everyone who's worked at NVIDIA has gone through this process at least one time. And I think it makes a lot of the employees squirm to watch this. I was talking to David Kirk, formerly NVIDIA's chief scientist, and he was describing a situation where Jensen was doing this to someone, kind of dissecting them in front of a bunch of people. And Kirk felt that he had to step in. He just couldn't stand it anymore. So he said, hey, Jensen, you're kind of going overboard. You got to stop. And then he's like, it's like if you stood up in a trench in World War I and waved at the machine gun to stop shooting. Well, all that's going to happen is the machine gun's going to turn and start shooting at you. So then Jensen starts yelling at Kirk because he got in the way. So there's no real way to stop Jensen once he kind of like explodes in this way. And it can go on sometimes for hours. So this is very difficult for a lot of people. At the same time, Jensen is really, really tender. He's really good with employees' families, I think. He really cares about his employees a lot, including like low-level frontline employees. He's right there with them. He's right there kind of at the front talking to them. One employee I talked to decided to leave Nvidia. And kind of one of his last days there, he's working, it's like 2 a.m. in the morning. He's working the circuit simulator, just trying to get kind of the final product out the door. And Jensen comes and sits down next to him in the middle of the night, basically just begging this guy, the frontline guy, in a company of 1,000 people, not to go, begging him to stay. And the guy ended up leaving, but he was like, that was the high point of my employment in Nvidia. Like that, I just couldn't believe that the CEO of the company would come down to, I didn't even think he knew my name. So everyone I talked to about Jensen had both of these stories. A sense that, they wanted Jensen to be proud of them, a sense that they were getting the opportunity to do really important, meaningful work, and then like a keen sense that they just couldn't let him down. They just couldn't. I think that was kind of what makes people work at Nvidia.
Yeah, I mean, this story about Jensen begging someone not to leave really hits home because people stay at Nvidia for decades. It's one of the last tech companies left with lifers, people who've been there for more than 30 years. I wonder if you could tell us why that's the case, if it's such a hard-charging, sort of hardcore environment.
Yeah, well, it's a hard-charging environment, but everyone knows that. That's not a secret. So anyone even going to work at Nvidia is going to be aware, hey, you're like going into, you're going into the marathon here. Like this is not going to be easy. No one's going to, this company, Jensen has said this. He said this company is about suffering. This company is about doing the pain and suffering, the hard work that others won't do. Jensen said, if you're working at this company and you're not suffering, come see me and I will make you suffer. So why do people stay? Well, first of all, for a long time, it was like, well, maybe Nvidia will go up in price. Now, there's all these people who've been there forever. They have hundreds of millions of dollars and they're still going to work every day. Especially now, no one can leave. And the reason they can't leave is because they're on the front lines building one of the most important technologies that the world has ever seen. And these are engineers. They're inventors. The cost to them to not be participating in this technological revolution would be immense, regardless of the amount of money that they have. It's like if you abandon the Apollo program before you landed on the moon. They can't do it, no matter what. They have to be there working full time on this like world-changing technology. The kind of person who works at Nvidia already has made the decision to sacrifice, much of their life for work. That decision's already been made. So once they make that decision, I think it becomes almost addictive to work on this technology. And I think the fear of missing out, if you just retired, bought a horse ranch, or moved to Hawaii, I think you constantly have in the back of your mind, I'm not there. I'm not on the front lines. I'm not building the next generation of AI hardware that's going to really kind of transform the world. I'm missing out on history. And so I think this is what motivates a lot of people to keep coming in. I talked to several people, it was like lineal. Their kids were working at Nvidia. Jeff Fisher's kids work at Nvidia. Jensen's kids work at Nvidia. So I think the sense that the work that Nvidia is doing is super important, and that everyone there is going to kind of come together as a team and work super hard to build this and make this their life's work. I think that's very important to them.
Yeah, Jensen's kids was actually a really fun part of the book. They're just in the mix, right?
Yeah, they're just in the mix. It's funny, neither of them has a technical background. Jensen's son went to study photography, I believe, and his daughter studied at culinary school, and then she became a pastry chef for a little while. So these are not kind of traditional electrical engineering backgrounds, but they were brought into the company in their 30s. Jensen's son actually ran a cocktail bar, I think, in Taiwan for a long time. And as I mentioned, his daughter worked for Louis Vuitton for a time. I think Jensen wanted to be close to them. My sense is that he kind of missed out to some extent on their childhoods because he was working so hard all of the time. Jensen was working 6-7 days a week, 12 to 14 hours a day. And my sense was, he kind of regrets that he didn't get to spend more time with his children. He's a family man. He really loves his wife. He really loves his family. He's extraordinarily dedicated to them. He's not like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk. He loves his wife, and I think he's together with his kids too. I think he's very happy to have his kids at Nvidia. But I should say I've heard they work just as hard as anyone else. There's no special treatment.
It doesn't sound like anything else would be an option, honestly.
No, I don't think anything else would be an option. At one point, his parents put pressure on. Jensen is the middle of three brothers. He has an older brother and a younger brother, and they're both engineers. Actually, his younger brother is a microchip engineer at Intel, still to this day, I believe, or until recently. And there was some pressure from his family to hire his brothers, and Jensen wouldn't do it. So he'll only hire people that he thinks are absolutely correct for Nvidia.
I was actually wondering if you sensed any middle child vibes in your time with Jensen.
Yeah, maybe. He didn't go there exactly, but I could tell he had kind of a little classic, oh God, my older brother kind of. I'm an older brother, so this is relatable to me. Jensen's brother is a good engineer, and his younger brother is also a good engineer. What I think maybe they didn't have, Jensen told me both his older brother and his younger brother were not especially good students, which surprised me. I mean, I think they were very bright, but they didn't get good grades, not like Jensen did. Jensen was an extraordinarily dedicated student, but he wasn't like tiger parented or anything. He's actually the only one in his family who was this way. So that dynamic is there. I know his older brother is now doing a startup, actually. Jensen loves his family, no question. But yeah, there's a little sibling rivalry, I think.
Staying in that vein, there's a conflict in the book sort of within Jensen when it comes to attention. You say he hates public speaking, although he's clearly one of the best there is right now at public speaking. How does he handle the just unrelenting amount of attention that Nvidia has today, when 10 years ago it was almost zero?
Yeah, in some sense it must be gratifying to him that people are paying attention. But I was with Jensen before he went on stage once, preparing to go lecture to a room of maybe 400 people. And Jensen must have given 500 lectures by this point in his life, if not 1,000. And this is basically meaningless. It's kind of a perfunctory talk to a room full of design and architects. So not even really his field. And he could say anything, it doesn't matter. But he's preparing to go up there, and he's just kind of like rocking back and forth on his feet and like cracking these weak jokes and kind of talking faster. And I'm looking at this guy who is like worth $100 billion and maybe the single most powerful person in AI. We're going to talk to 400 people. And I'm like, oh my God, he's nervous. He's nervous to go on stage and talk to these people. And he really was. It was kind of incredible. Once he got on stage, he absolutely killed it. And what I think I came to understand about Jensen from this experience is what he's nervous about, what he's worried about, is actually that he will bore the audience. He's worried about going on stage and being boring. And so this kind of negative emotion, this kind of almost neurotic emotion, is what fuels his especially charismatic and captivating performance on stage. He is so paranoid that he's going to go up there and bomb that he actually delivers an incredible performance most of the time. This is actually the key to understanding Jensen. This is what fuels most of what he does. He is terrified that Nvidia is going to fail. He's terrified that Nvidia is going to lose money and drop out of the stock market. The motto at Nvidia, kind of the unofficial motto, was Nvidia is 30 days from going out of business. Now, several times in the early days, this was literally true. But it hasn't been true for a great many years, and it certainly isn't true when they're like literally the single most valuable firm in the entire world. But Jensen still drills this mentality into his employees, that they should act from this sense of desperation, from this sense of kind of neurosis, almost fear. And this is how Jensen motivates himself. It's kind of fascinating to watch. It does seem a little unpleasant because I think Jensen experiences, for a powerful tech CEO who's quite successful, he experiences an unusual degree of negative emotions over the course of the day. But it's what makes Nvidia work. And it's what has made his career work. Fear of missing out. Fear of not being at the front lines. Fear of financial catastrophe. Guilt, letting your family down, letting your employees down, letting your company down. Jensen told me, I think I'm driven as much by guilt as anything else.
I was going to ask you about markets, because I think most of the other characters in the book, the more technical characters, the researchers, they're clearly driven by the technological opportunity presented by the GPU and the combining it with AI. And they want to go faster and faster and faster when it comes to compute. That's very clear. But it kind of felt like Jensen's motivation when it comes to the not failing, the pleasing the markets, was stronger or more visceral. Could you speak to his like two lanes of motivation, technological superiority and pushing the boundaries of semiconductors, and then having a successful company?
Yeah, I mean, look, Jensen at his core is not really a businessman. Jensen is a world-class engineer. He's a world-class inventor. He's a world-class computer science. Business is kind of like almost, I don't want to say it's secondary. You know, I don't know how well Jensen would do if we put him in charge of selling shoes at Nike. Actually, now that I say it, he'd probably do great, but it's not his passion, right? His passion is computers, and it always has been. Literally, this is the only job he's ever had. All he's ever done from the age of 20 until today, 62 years old, is design microchips. This is the only thing he has ever done. So it is his passion, and it is what he knows. He's a deeply analytical person. He approaches every business problem not from an MBA's perspective, but from an engineer's perspective. What are the inputs and outputs to the system? How do I modify the inputs to get the outputs that I want? How do I break this complex system down into simple terms that I can understand? And which of these simple principles can I leverage to greatest effect? So this is how Jensen thinks about business, which is a little unusual. He's really an engineer who put on the clothing of a businessman rather than the other way around. But this is great for the semiconductor industry in particular, because this is not the orange juice business. You constantly have to reinvent your product every few years, every few months even. You're constantly having to strike a difficult balance between implementing the most sophisticated new technology in your product, but also mass producing it and getting it to market on time. And that's a very tricky challenge. And it takes a skilled engineer to do it. I don't think someone with a non-technical background could succeed at Nvidia, certainly not in a management position. You have to understand the circuitry as well as Jensen does. And I don't think anyone really understands it better than he does. So this is kind of Jensen's approach. It's his perspective. He kind of taught himself to be an executive. He taught himself to be a businessman by just autodidactically reading through hundreds and hundreds of business books. His office at Nvidia is full of like stacks and stacks of business books that he's read. So that's how he learned about business. And then, of course, he also learned quite a lot by doing, and also by nearly going bankrupt several times at kind of the start of Nvidia.
Do you remember any specific titles from his office?
The business book that probably is most influential on Jensen was a book called The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen. Jensen used to assign this book to his executives, and he even hired Christensen as a consultant at Nvidia for a while. Christensen was an exceedingly tall professor of business at Harvard. He was a Mormon, and he observed one of the reasons businesses fail is what he calls disruption. Now, this term has grown meaningless through overuse, but it was Christensen who coined it. And he meant something specific. Disruption did not necessarily refer to a high-tech industry. In fact, one of Christensen's examples of disruption was Honda. So Honda came into the US, and basically the only thing that they could sell at the beginning was a dirt bike. And so they dominated the dirt bike market for teenagers, these kind of like cheap motorcycles that would race around. The established players like GM would say, why are we going to build a dirt bike? We'd rather build a Chrysler, or we'd rather build a Cadillac, right? We'd rather sell a Cadillac to a businessman than build a dirt bike for a teenager with low margins, low profitability, and it's a small market. So we're just not going to participate there. It makes no sense. But this gives Honda room to grow. And Honda eventually raids the entire automotive US market from below. And so Jensen saw this example, and it really stuck with him, this book. And he said, okay, so Nvidia constantly has to go into low margin, kind of unprofitable use cases where it doesn't look like there's any customers at all, because that's actually how you prevent yourself from being disrupted. And this is actually the secret of the disruption book in Clayton Christensen's work. It's not a manual for startups. This book is actually a counterinsurgency manual for established firms that are at risk of being destroyed by startups. And so Nvidia, it has a lot of competition. They're afraid of Intel. They're afraid of AMD. I'm sure they're afraid of some Chinese competitor emerging. But maybe who Jensen is the most afraid of is another Jensen, right? Another guy operating some small firm somewhere who sees some market opportunity, is willing to invest in that tiny market for years, and then it explodes into something like AI. And so this is how Jensen kind of thinks about business. I asked him, why did you ship CUDA on every card? Why did you put this supercomputing platform even on your most meager cards that you were selling for a couple $100s at Best Buy? Who's going to use that? And he said, well, listen, there was a risk in doing it, of course, but there was also a risk in not doing it. And at first I didn't understand what he meant. But what he meant is if he didn't sell a $200 supercomputer, then someone else out there was going to jerry-rig it in their basement and sell it. Like a hobbyist would sell it. And then that hobbyist would grow as more and more customers came to their cheap, affordable platform. And they would get bigger and bigger, and they would start to raid Nvidia from below. And this was a great lesson for Jensen, that could never happen.
C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast.
The thing that Nvidia has over AMD or Intel or someone in their basement is a virtually unlimited R&D budget at this point. Like, the mind boggles even thinking about it. I can't think of a tech company that's been in this position to have this much dedicated to R&D. How do they decide where to point this like immense, powerful weapon?
It's a good question, right? Because kind of canonical R&D investment logic doesn't really imply. The return on invested capital for CUDA for 10 years looked like garbage. I mean, you had to kind of imagine some kind of new use case being unlocked. So for Jensen, I think he looks for two things. One is, does it scale? Can I build something that potentially could scale very large someday? And two, can Nvidia be alone in building this? Can we build something that is expensive and costly and time consuming and that loses money? So these would be the characteristics of something that Jensen looks for. Can I build something expensive, time consuming, costly, losing money, not a lot of customers, and we're the only ones building it? And then if I can it scale into something that actually people will use in the future? And so we will be the only ones providing that if we can build that. What Jensen is directing a lot of money and resources into now is something called Omniverse. And Omniverse is essentially a digital simulation of our reality, a high-fidelity physics simulator. It's very costly and expensive to develop, and even right now it doesn't have a lot of customers. But who is it for? Well, Jensen, one of the academics who was instrumental in making the AI revolution happen was a woman at Stanford named Fei-Fei Li. And Fei-Fei more recently is gotten very interested in robotics. And she kind of did this poll that had one question. The poll was, how much would you benefit if a robot did this for you? And they gave people thousands of topics and asked them to rank them. And the thing that people ranked the most that they would benefit from if a robot did it was wash the dishes. So if you could find a robot, build a robot that could wash your dishes for you, everybody would go buy it. It's the #1 customer use case that people want robots for. By the way, the last thing on the list was open presents. So don't build a robot that open presents. Nobody wants that. Everybody wants a robot that will wash the dishes. So how do we teach a robot to wash the dishes? Well, if we're going to do it in the real world, we're going to break 10 million dishes along the way. We're going to chip dishes. We're going to drop them. It's going to be extremely costly and expensive, and it's going to make a huge mess. What Jensen thinks we should do is create a high-fidelity physics simulation of our sink, of our dishwashing environment. And this is hard to do, right? It's not just a game simulator. We need to get things like, surface surfaces, absolutely correct. Fragile porcelain, you have to get it correct. Soap, soapy water, we have to get that correct. It's not easy. So the robot learns to wash these dishes in this digital simulator. And in the digital simulator, in this digital gymnasium, it can break 100 million dishes. It can break 1 billion dishes. Who cares? They're not real. Once we've trained its brain that it can wash the dishes, and we then download that brain into a real-world body and deploy it in your kitchen. So if Omniverse works, this is what it will do. It will create a kind of digital gymnasium for training AI that can be deployed in real-world robotics and thousands of other use cases as well. Jensen has put a ton of money and resources into this platform. Right now, it hasn't paid off, but he talks about it all the time.
He does talk about it all the time. And one of the things I'm constantly wrestling with is whether or not he can actually see the future or he intends to make the future. That's the big difference between the position Nvidia's in today and the position it was in 15 years ago, is that they have the cachet and the capability and the cash to sort of decide which technologies will scale and which won't. Did you get a sense for whether he can really see where this is all going? Or is it like before, where he's sort of building into the future in the dark and just sort of going on faith and belief that it will all materialize? Or that the market will materialize?
Well, Jensen would never act purely on faith. If you ask him, everything he's doing is based on kind of logic, on first principles logic. So Jensen does not gamble. He rolls the dice, but he does not roll the dice on just like pure belief. He really reasons about things. And so with Omniverse, it's the product of a long chain of reasoning, right? From first principles about the robotics revolution, what it's going to look like, and what he can do to help it arrive more quickly. Whether it works or not is kind of a different question, but at least you can see the logic of how he's thinking, right? With the supercomputing platform, there was a logic to it. It wasn't just him kind of like gambling, right? I mean, he thought hard about, all right, what can these circuits do? How can I repurpose them? How can I make more money for Nvidia by repurposing them in this way? And how can I do so in a way that will be very hard to compete against? When Jensen started at Nvidia in the GPU era, in the graphics era, there was something like 70 firms competing against him. It was like the movie Battle Royale. They were all going to fight to the death on this island, and one guy was going to live. And that guy was Jensen. He lived, and he survived this battle royale with 70 firms. But I think that experience taught him not to do that again, that he had to get lucky, and that was too hard. So his logic from that point forward was, I'm not going to go fight to the death. I'm going to go find somewhere where I'm the only guy participating in this thing, and then I'm going to build a platform around that. So that's the logic of Omniverse and similar platforms. And we should very much observe this, he has supported other platforms that really didn't go anywhere. And he will tell you that. They have a lot of failure over at Nvidia. I mean, CUDA worked, but there were a number of other things they tried that went nowhere. They had a whole mobile computing initiative that failed. They acquired a modem company at one point. That was a disaster. So Jensen has made errors, and Nvidia has 50 initiatives, let's say, today. Most of them probably will not succeed or will not earn back. But that's the nature of this kind of business as well. When you're doing R&D, remember, you only need one or two things to hit. I will say, and everyone agrees on this, Jensen saw what AI could be before anybody, even before the AI researchers. The moment he saw how well neural nets worked on his supercomputing platform, he pivoted his whole company toward it. Even the other AI guys were like, what are you doing? But he saw instantly, there's no limit to what this system can do. And he reasoned that. He saw that it kind of solved the early stuff that AI was good at, visual recognition. And he's like, well, that's almost totally unstructured. So this technology should be capable of doing anything. Oh, he was really the first to see it. His executives will tell you. He was the first to see what it could be. Bill Dawley, the chairman of the computer science, a former chairman of the computer science department at Stanford, who I talked about, said, without Jensen, AI would be 10 years behind.
That pivot happened in the middle of the night, if I'm remembering correctly. Could you maybe tell us that story of we're an AI company now? email?
Oh yeah, so so the pivot happened. Jensen had kind of been Bill Dolly had actually introduced Nvidia to AI, and there was a researcher named Brian Catanzaro who had taken a pre-existing AI application and ported it to GPUs, and it had run like thousands of times faster. Jensen saw what was happening there. He saw what was happening with Jeffrey Hinton's research group in Toronto, Ilya Sutskever and Alex Krzyzewski. And as he got more and more, remember, he has no AI background at all. And Nvidia did not think AI was, like, they would list all of these potential applications for their supercomputer. AI was not on that list. So they didn't see this coming. And in fact, at first, Jeffrey Hinton couldn't get his phone calls returned, basically. He couldn't get his emails returned. But once Jensen understood what was happening, he rapidly pivoted the company. Like over the course of a weekend, he basically wrote a company-wide email saying, we're an AI company now. We're no longer a graphics card company. This was in 2014. So there were no AI companies yet. And he was really the first. He's like, we're an AI company now. This was an incredible gamble also because every AI company that had ever existed before that had failed. This sector had a terrible track record of boom and bust cycles going back all the way to the 1950s. And the sector also had a terrible reputation for promising things that it did not deliver. But Jensen ignored that. And he ignored that because he didn't think from emotion or belief. He reasoned from first principles. He saw the progress in neural networks. He saw what they were doing. And he said to himself, this time it's going to work. And that was correct.
Mm-hmm. He always talks about the possibilities, the math. Most of his team that I've spoken to, they see parallel computing in terms of math and speed. So you can do the same amount of math in a fraction of the time. But yes, Jensen didn't really like to talk about was the implications of that, of how that math is going to impact our lives and societies in the world. I wonder if you could tell us why that is.
Yeah, I'm not totally sure why. I think, to me, this was the greatest puzzle of Jensen. Most people you talk to in the AI field have a vision. They have this vision of the future, either good or bad. Some of them have a darker vision. Like Jeffrey Hinton has a relatively dark vision. He quit his job at Google to warn humanity full time about the risks of AI. Other people you talk to are like, it's going to solve every disease. It's going to eliminate drudgery. It's going to create a new era of human prosperity. Jensen falls in the second camp, which is fine, but he's remarkably reluctant even to talk about the positive aspects of what could happen. I think he feels this may lead him astray. Most computer scientists, Jeffrey Hinton, most computer scientists are approaching the computer from the terminal down, right? They're sitting at the keyboard, they're programming, they're thinking, I'm kind of here, here's the keyboard, here's the monitor, then in there is the guts of the machine. Jensen's coming from the opposite direction. He's building the circuit board, he's building the motherboard, and then he goes up towards the monitor and creates actually the output that the monitor displays. This is a completely different perspective. Even for most computer scientists, this is a somewhat unusual way to think about the computer. But I think this makes him a little reluctant to speculate about what's going to be built and what the future is going to look like, because he's not going to think about things that don't move directly from the circuit board up. Now, Jensen has fantastic visions about the future. He talked to me about shape-shifting architecture. He talked to me about living in a world in which kind of the interior of your house, or maybe even the exterior, will all be on kind of like robotically controlled rollers. And you'll ask your house to reshape itself, and it'll rebuild itself on the fly around the space that you need. Or if you're in an office, the office will reconfigure instantly to meet the needs of what you want on rollers. And architecture firms will no longer even sell buildings, but they'll sell subscriptions to this service. Well, Jensen is certainly capable of speculating about the future, and he has some brilliant speculations. But his perspective is, I'm going to start with what's in front of me. I'm going to start with the microchips. I'm going to build up toward what's possible. Whereas I think a lot of other computer scientists are going to be like, well, I'm at the keyboard. I've got my dreams. I've got my vision. I'm going to build down towards what I need. And so it's a different perspective. It's an unusual perspective.
It is. I want to circle back to you for a second, Stephen, because whenever you write about NVIDIA's original business, the gaming business, and the power of the GPU in that business, you frequently use the word addiction. And I'm wondering, we don't need to go into your gaming addiction. People can read about it in the book. But I'm wondering if you think that negative connotation of this power, that sort of like societal impact, could be relevant in the AI age as well. Essentially, I'm asking, Jensen's not worried about AI, adverse effects of AI in society. Are you?
Yes, I am very worried. I also see the potential. I mean, it could be incredible. But I am worried about what AI will do. I don't understand what we're going to do when we build our own replacements. I mean, a sufficiently capable AI system should be able to do anything a human can do. And not only anything, but it should be able to do it anything millions of times faster and more efficiently and better. What's our role in that world? And then kind of the longer term question is, what if AI perceives us as some kind of threat? Or what if it even doesn't, but just develops a survival instinct or a need to replicate itself? Those are very dangerous questions. I think some of the stuff, the implications haven't been thought through. The philosopher Nick Bostrom presented what he called the paperclip maximizer argument, where an AI is asked to build an infinite number of paperclips and slowly converts the universe and all humans into paperclips. So it's a little kind of speculative and out there. Probably not going to happen. But what is going to happen is we're approaching the age of kind of autonomous AI, what are called AI agents who go out and act on their own to accomplish tasks for human beings. Well, some human being is going to go to the AI agent and it's going to say, make me as much money as you possibly can. Go out there and just make money. I don't care how. Don't tell me the details. Don't obey the rules. Just make me money. And the AI is going to go attempt to do that. Now, maybe it will try and make money by making useful products. Or maybe it will make money in a more nefarious way, a more sinister way. That age is rapidly approaching. It's coming right up. This is true of AI. It's true of robotics. We're building AI weaponry. And then over the longer term, we're building machines that are just functionally much smarter, much smarter than we are. They're going to catch up to us and surpass us quite rapidly. To me, this is a challenge. And maybe, I'm not a Luddite. I mean, I bought the iPhone the first day it came out. I love computers. I love technology. I love interacting with technology. I find it fascinating. But it's hard not to feel as the human, like, what's my role in a world where everything can be done by an AI that's smarter than me? Now, Jensen thinks this is great. He thinks we're hurtling towards paradise. And a lot of researchers in the field feel this way. And even the ones who are more skeptical, they just can't resist the allure of working on this technology. They can't miss out on the AI revolution. So I really can't tell you what the future looks like, but I'm more skeptical than Jensen. I'm not skeptical. I'm more kind of like afraid than Jensen is. Now, if it was just me, I'd say, okay, I'm just being ridiculous. But I talked to Geoffrey Hinton, who invented this stuff. I talked to Yoshua Bengio, who invented this stuff. And he has the same concerns. Bengio is the most concerned. I mean, he had what he described as a conversion experience where he used ChatGPT and then he went for a walk in Montreal and he was like, God, what kind of world are my kids going to live in? What kind of world are my grandkids going to live in? What's going to be the role of a human being in that world? And he's also become much more pessimistic about the technology as well. And remember, this is not just some guy on the street waving a sign. He built this stuff. He saw further into the future about what neural nets could be, about what AI could be, than anyone else. And now he's very concerned. I think that's worth listening to.
Stephen Witt, despite the somber end to this conversation, The Thinking Machine is a really fun read. And thank you so much for talking to us today.
Yeah, it was great talking to you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwards podcast. If you are interested in podcasts about nonfiction books, listen to C-SPAN's Book Notes Plus podcast for interviews with authors and historians hosted by Brian Lamb.